Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. In the village of Umuofia, a name that resonates with pride and strength, lived a man who had carved out his place in the world through sheer force of will. His name was Okonkwo, a respected leader, a formidable wrestler, and a man both admired and feared. His fame had spread beyond the 9 villages of the region after he threw Amalans the cat, a great wrestler who had gone unbeaten for 7 years. That single victory, earned when Okonkwo was still a young man, marked the beginning of his lifelong quest to distance himself from the shadow of his father. Unoka, Okonkwo's father, had been gentle, kind-hearted, and artistic qualities that in the traditional masculine world of the Igbo people translated to weakness. He was poor, lazy in the eyes of his neighbors, and perpetually in debt. He played the flute and loved company, but he was never able to provide for his family or gain any real respect in the community. Okonkwo hated everything his father represented. More than anything, he feared becoming like him. That fear, deeply rooted in shame, was the engine behind Okonkwo's drive for success, his harsh discipline, and his refusal to show emotion. By the time his story begins, Okonkwo has earned 3 titles, a mark of prestige in Igbo society. He owns 2 barns full of yams, the staple crop and symbol of wealth, and he has 2 wives and several children. His compound bustles with activity, a reflection of his success. Yet even in his victories, there's a restlessness in him, a fire that burns so intensely it threatens to consume what he's built. He works relentlessly and demands the same of others, often meting out harsh punishments to those he deems weak or lazy. His household lives under a constant current of tension, and his sons, especially Enwoy, feel the weight of his expectations like a yoke around their necks. The village of Umuofia itself is tightly woven with traditions, rituals, and communal values. It is a place where the gods are ever present, where the oracle speaks and people listen, and where personal achievement is celebrated so long as it doesn't defy the collective will. The people honor the earth goddess Annie, observe the week of peace, and gather in the Ilo, the village square, to watch wrestling matches, conduct meetings, and celebrate festivals. Life is cyclical and sacred. Every action has consequence, every offense a spiritual and communal cost. Okonkwo's home life reflects his inner world disciplined but strained. His wives are often scolded and sometimes beaten, though this is not unusual in his society. Still, Okonkwo's punishments often exceed what's considered acceptable, a sign that he is not just upholding tradition, but battling something within himself. His eldest son, Enwoy, is a quiet boy with a sensitivity that unnerves his father. Okonkwo believes he sees his own father in the boy, and he responds with aggression rather than understanding. The boy's silence deepens, and a gap begins to form between them, as wide and uncertain as the future that looms on the horizon. One day, news reaches Umuofia that a member of the tribe has been killed at a neighboring village's marketplace. In the old ways of justice, such a crime cannot go unpunished. The neighboring village, to avoid war with the powerful Umuofia, sends a peace offering, a virgin girl, and a 15-year-old boy named Ikemefuna. The girl is sent to the bereaved family, while the boy is entrusted to to Okonkwo's care, though he is told to treat him as a ward of the clan. Okonkwo accepts the boy into his household, and Ikemefuna becomes a part of the family, unaware of the tragic role he will come to play. Ikemefuna is different from Enwoy, charismatic, confident, full of stories and songs. Over time, he wins over the household, including Enwoy, who begins to change under his influence. Enwoy starts acting more manly, showing an eagerness to help with the heavy tasks, listening closely to the stories of the elders, and slowly gaining his father's approval. Okonkwo, though he does not show affection openly, begins to feel something for the boy too, pride, even love. But he keeps those feelings buried deep, hidden behind a wall of stoicism and masculinity. In his world, emotions are a weakness he cannot afford to display. Despite his success and status, Okonkwo's pride often leads him into trouble. During the sacred week of peace, a time when all forms of violence are strictly forbidden, he beats his youngest wife for failing to prepare his meal on time. The village is outraged. Even the priests and elders who respect him cannot ignore the offense. Okonkwo must offer sacrifices to the gods to atone, but the incident leaves a mark. It's a reminder that in a society guided by balance and harmony, even the strongest man can overstep, and power without restraint is dangerous. As the agricultural season begins, the labor-intensive process of planting and cultivating yams dominates village life. The rituals surrounding farming are not just practical, but spiritual. Each stage, from clearing the land to the first rains, is accompanied by ceremonies and prayers. Okonkwo pushes his sons to work harder, especially Enwoy, who tries desperately to live up to his father's rigid expectations. The strain grows, but so too does Ikemefuna's place in their lives. He thrives in his new home, calling Okonkwo father and filling a space in the family that feels almost natural. But fate, like the seasons, turns without warning. After 3 years of peace, laughter, and harvests, the clan's elders make a decision. The oracle has spoken, and the boy must die. Though no reason is given beyond the will of the gods, the decision is final. The elders decree that Ikemefuna must be taken out of the village and killed as a form of ritual justice. Okonkwo is advised not to take part in the boy's death, since he has grown close to him. But Okonkwo, ever concerned with appearing strong, cannot bear the thought of seeming weak in the eyes of his peers. So he joins the procession, and when the boy, realizing something is wrong, runs to him for help, calling him father, it is Okonkwo who delivers the fatal blow. The act severs something invisible but essential inside him. Though he tries to suppress the guilt, burying it in silence and rage, the ripple is felt throughout the household. Enwoy, who loved Ikemefuna like a brother, senses what happened even before it is confirmed. Something breaks within the boy too, something that will not heal easily. Back in Umuofia, life continues as before, but within the walls of Okonkwo's compound, a quiet disintegration begins. The man who rose above his father's failures now carries a different kind of burden, one born not of weakness, but of choice. And in the shadows of tradition, honor, and fear, a fracture begins to form, foreshadowing the deeper fall yet to come. The death of Ikemefuna lingers like a curse over Okonkwo's household, though no one dares speak of it aloud. The boy had lived with them for 3 years, long enough to root himself into the daily rhythms of the compound, to plant laughter in the mouths of children, and to turn even the stern heart of Okonkwo with pride. Now, with his blood spilled on the path just beyond the village, something sacred feels broken. Okonkwo tells himself he acted with honor, that he followed the will of the oracle and upheld the law of his people. But the truth haunts him in silence. For 2 days, he is unable to eat or sleep, haunted by dreams he cannot explain and emotions he refuses to acknowledge. He tells himself that weakness is a womanly thing, that his sorrow is a betrayal of his strength. So he pushes it away with the only tools he knows: work, anger, and violence. He turns his fury inward and outward, snapping at his wives, barking orders at his sons, throwing himself into the grueling physical labor of preparing for the next farming cycle. But there is a void in the house now, one that cannot be filled by yams or authority. Enwoy, once lit with the joy of brotherhood and newfound confidence, becomes sullen and withdrawn. Though no words pass between father and son, the silence between them deepens into something vast and unreachable. Enwoy does not need to be told what happened to Ikemefuna. He knows. He felt it in his bones the day his friend was led away and never returned. And though he does not confront his father, something inside him hardens, a quiet rebellion that will one day come to define him. While grief simmers beneath the surface, life in Umuofia goes on. The arrival of the new Yam Festival, one of the most joyful and important celebrations in the Igbo calendar, offers a brief reprieve from the tension that shadows the compound. The festival honors Annie, the earth goddess, who sustains the people through their harvests. It is a time of renewal when old yams are discarded, homes are cleaned, and ancestors are remembered with reverence. Women adorn themselves with intricate body paint and colorful wrappers. Men share kola nuts, palm wine flows freely, and the drums call people to the village square. Okonkwo, however, finds no joy in the festivities. Though appearances must be kept, he sees the celebration as a disruption of his routine, a waste of precious time that could be spent working. His household walks on eggshells as he broods. When his second wife, Ekwefi, makes a remark he perceives as disrespectful, he fires his gun at her in a fit of rage. The bullet misses, but the act shocks even his hardened family. In a culture that values control and harmony, such a display is more than mere anger, it is dangerous. Ekwefi is no stranger to suffering. Once the village beauty, she had left her first husband to be with Okonkwo, captivated by his strength. But her life since then has been marked by sorrow. She bore 10 children, but only one survived her daughter Ezinma, a child as sharp and resilient as her mother. The bond between Ekwefi and Ezinma is unlike anything else in the compound, tender, fierce, and forged through shared grief. Ezinma is not just a daughter, but a miracle, a child believed to be an Ogbanj, a spirit that repeatedly dies and returns to torment its mother. But this one lived, and for Ekwefi, that is enough to believe in something beyond pain. Ezinma, though still a girl, possesses a wisdom and grace that even Okonkwo secretly admires. She understands his moods in a way no one else does, and unlike Enwoy, she meets his intensity without flinching. Yet he cannot say this aloud. He laments that Ezinma is not a boy, believing she would have made a better heir than his disappointing son. It is a thought he buries as quickly as it comes, for in Umuofia, men do not dwell on what cannot be changed. As the village prepares for the annual wrestling matches, an event that brings together neighboring clans and showcases the strength and agility of young warriors, there is a temporary lifting of spirits. The arena, buzzing with drumming, singing, and anticipation, becomes a place where boys become men and reputations are forged. It is a reminder of Okonkwo's own youthful triumphs, the match that made him a legend. He watches the new generation with a mix of pride and anxiety, knowing that every victory carries the weight of legacy. But fate, like a brewing storm, does not wait for celebration to end. In Umuofia, the line between the sacred and the everyday is always thin. One day, during a funeral ceremony for a respected elder, tragedy strikes. Amidst the firing of ceremonial guns, a traditional tribute to the deceased, Okonkwo's gun misfires and kills a young boy, the son of the dead man. In a society as structured and spiritual as the Igbos, this is not merely an accident, it is a crime against the earth goddess. The punishment is immediate and absolute. Okonkwo was banished for 7 years. The land must be cleansed of the abomination, and to do so, he must return to his motherland in exile. His compound is burned, his animals killed, his titles stripped. It is not an act of hatred, but of ritual necessity. For all his strength and reputation, Okonkwo is now a man undone by fate, a warrior cast out by the very society he sought so desperately to uphold. He leaves with his wives and children, returning to Mbanta, the village of his mother's kin. There, among unfamiliar faces and softer customs, he must live as a man without status. It is a humiliation that cuts deeper than any blade, one that challenges everything he believes about manhood, honor, and destiny. Yet even in exile, the fire in him does not go out. He tells himself he will return stronger than ever, reclaim his place, and silence those who pity him. But far beyond the borders of Umuofia and Mbanta, change is coming. White men have begun to appear along the coasts, strangers with strange beliefs, whose presence has already stirred trouble in other lands. They bring not only new religion, but new laws, new ways of thinking that threaten to unravel the very fabric of Igbo life. And while Okonkwo dreams of returning in glory, the world he left behind is beginning to shift beneath the surface, slowly, silently, like roots breaking stone. Mbanta, the village of Okonkwo's mother, receives him with quiet acceptance. Though it is not his true home, the customs of the Igbo people hold the motherland in special regard. When a man is afflicted, cast down by misfortune or disgrace, he seeks refuge not in the arms of his father, but in those of his mother. Mbanta embraces Okonkwo and his family with the compassion reserved for such occasions, not with celebration, but with shelter and understanding. Still, to Okonkwo, it feels like a bitter defeat. Everything he had built in Umuofia, his titles, his reputation, his farm, his household pride, lies in ashes behind him. In Mbanta, he is no longer a man of influence. He is merely a guest, a disgraced warrior, rebuilding from nothing. His maternal uncle, Achendu, an elder of the village, offers him land and a place to stay. Achendu is wise and patient, a man whose words flow not from ego, but from long observation. When Okonkwo broods silently over his fall from grace, Achendu speaks to him not as an accuser, but as a reminder of humility. He tells him of suffering deeper than Okonkwo's own, how he buried 22 children, and yet lived to carry on. He urges him to let go of pride, to see exile not as an end, but as a beginning, a chance to understand a different kind of strength. Okonkwo listens, but only partly. His thoughts often drift back to Umuofia, to the land of his triumphs and failures. He counts the passing moons like a prisoner, marks the walls of his cell, waiting for the day he can return, and reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. His spirit is restless. Even in toil, he dreams of the yam fields he lost, the titles he will win again, the name he will restore. Yet time does not stand still, and while Okonkwo adjusts to life in exile, a quiet storm begins to take shape in the region. Stories arrive from neighboring villages, whispers of pale-skinned men appearing with strange clothing, foreign tongues, and powerful magic. They preach of a new God, one who sees all as equal, who condemns the worship of idols, who promises eternal life not through ancestors, but through faith. At first, the people of Mbanta laugh off these tales. What people could be so foolish as to abandon the ways of their forefathers? But the strangers come closer. One day, a group of missionaries arrives in Mbanta. Unlike warriors or traders, they carry no weapons, only books and words. Their leader, a man named Mr. Brown, speaks through an interpreter, offering peace and dialogue. He does not insult the gods of the village, but calmly explains that he brings news of one true God. The villagers gather more out of curiosity than belief. They listen, puzzled and amused. Some scoff openly. Others shake their heads. But among the audience, a few hearts stir not with faith, not yet, but with intrigue. The missionaries ask for land to build their church. Mbanta, confident that no godless building will thrive on sacred soil, gives them a plot in the evil forest, a cursed place where generations have been buried in shame, where no one dares live or farm. It is, to the elders, an unspoken sentence of failure. But when the church not only survives but thrives, the villagers begin to question. The ground does not swallow them. No lightning strikes. The converts grow bolder. It is a subtle but undeniable crack in the foundation of tradition. Among the converts is Enwoy. He has grown distant from Okonkwo since the day Ikemefuna was led away. Something in him, soft, thoughtful, questioning, has never aligned with his father's rigid expectations of masculinity. The rhythms of Igbo life, the violence, the sacrifices, the silence around grief, they left wounds on his spirit. When he hears the missionaries speak of love, of a father who does not demand suffering, of peace that requires no killing, something inside him responds. It feels like water to a parched root. He begins to visit the church in secret, drawn not just by the words, but by the sense of belonging he has never felt in his own home. He asks questions. He listens. And then, one day, he joins. When Okonkwo hears, his fury is volcanic. He confronts Enwoy with trembling rage, his voice rising like thunder, demanding to know how his own son could betray him, betray his people, betray the gods. But Enwoy says nothing. There is no fight in him, no apology either, only a quiet decision to walk away. Okonkwo cannot contain his disgust. To him, Enwoy is no longer his son, but a weakling who has chosen a coward's path. He beats him, but the boy does not return. Enwoy finds sanctuary among the missionaries, who see in him not a lost soul, but a found one. For the first time in his life, he belongs not as a warrior or a laborer, but as a person whose questions are allowed, even welcomed. This betrayal cuts Okonkwo deeper than exile ever did. It is not merely about a son's disobedience, it is a personal failure. His legacy is crumbling, not from outside forces, but from within his own bloodline. He begins to see the arrival of the white men not as a curiosity, but as a threat, one that poisons the hearts of his people and robs them of their traditions. And yet, even as he despairs, the influence of the missionaries continues to grow. They establish a school, teaching not just faith, but literacy and Western thought. begin to attract not only the misfits and the curious, but those who see opportunity in change. The very pillars of Igbo society, kinship, ritual, masculinity, earth worship, are slowly being challenged, not by war, but by words. Still, in Mbanta, resistance holds. The elders, including Achendu, remind the people of who they are, of the stories and customs that have bound them for generations. They urge patience, hoping that the strange wind will pass. But Okonkwo sees only danger. He believes that strength must answer strength, that the arrival of these men must be met with force. If not, everything will fall apart. He bides his time, but the urgency in him grows. Each convert feels like a wound, each church song like a drumbeat of war. He waits for the day he can return to Umuofia and reclaim his place. But when that day comes, what will be left to reclaim? 7 years pass in exile, not swiftly, but with the weight of each season pressing on Okonkwo's shoulders. In that time, he rebuilds his household in Mbanta with diligence, if not joy. He plants yams, raises his sons to be hardworking, and maintains a life of routine. But his heart remains tethered to Umuofia, where he imagines his return in triumphant tones, visions of reclaiming his titles, restoring his lost honor, and rising again as a great man among his people. When the time finally comes to return, Okonkwo prepares meticulously. He sends money ahead to his friend Obirika to build huts and prepare his compound in Umuofia. He dreams of grand feasts and celebration, assuming his homecoming will be met with admiration for his perseverance and strength. But the world he returns to is not the one he left behind. In his absence, Umuofia has changed in ways that disturb him deeply. The influence of the white men has taken root. Not only do the missionaries now have a permanent presence in Umuofia, but they have also established a government of sorts, a court system run by the district commissioner and enforced by native messengers, often young converts eager to exercise new power. They dress in foreign clothes and issue punishments according to alien laws. The clan's traditional systems of justice, honor, and reconciliation are being overridden by written codes and distant rulers. Okonkwo is dismayed. He expected to find a people ready to fight, to drive out the invaders who mocked their gods and traditions. Instead, he sees hesitation, fear, accommodation. Many of the clan's strongest men have grown quiet, uncertain of how to respond to the changes. The new religion has carved out its own village church, and its followers include men once cast aside, outcasts, debtors, sons like Enwoy. Even families that once scorned the missionaries now send their children to the white men's schools, seeking the promised rewards of literacy and progress. Okonkwo tries to rally resistance to stir the hearts of his clansmen. He speaks with urgency and anger, invoking the pride of their ancestors. But many shake their heads. They do not like the changes, but they fear war even more. And the younger generation, those who were children when Okonkwo left, have grown up in a world where the white man's presence is not new, but normal. The customs that once seemed eternal now feel fragile in the face of this quiet conquest. The missionaries are not all the same. Mr. Brown, the original envoy of the church, is a man of cautious respect. He makes an effort to understand the Igbo worldview, even if he does not share it. He speaks gently, urging peace, building trust through conversation rather than force. He listens more than he preaches, and it is through this patience that he earns converts. He works alongside local elders, even as he plants the seeds of change in their midst. But Mr. Brown is eventually replaced by a different kind of man. Reverend James Smith is stern and uncompromising. To him, there is no wisdom in blending cultures, no merit in the traditions of the Igbo. He sees only sin and salvation. Where Mr. Brown encouraged dialogue, Mr. Smith demands obedience. His presence deepens the divide. The church no longer feels like a foreign curiosity. It becomes a fortress, a symbol of defiance to the clan's authority. Tensions mount when one of the Christian converts commits a grievous act. In a village festival honoring the earth goddess, a masked egwugwu, a sacred ancestral spirit represented by a costumed elder, is unmasked by a zealous convert. The act is sacrilege, a violent tearing of the spiritual fabric that binds the community. The clan is outraged. It is no longer a matter of religion, but one of survival. The church is now threatening not only belief, but identity itself. In a rare act of unity, the elders of Umuofia gather. They consult among themselves, and in the end, they choose a measured response. They march to the church and burn it to the ground, not in wild violence, but as a calculated message. This is not a war, they insist, but a warning, a demand for respect. Yet the act sets into motion a series of events that cannot be reversed. Soon after, the leaders of Umuofia, including Okonkwo, are summoned by the district commissioner for a meeting. They go with some reluctance, but no weapons, assuming it is a chance to explain themselves. Instead, they are ambushed, handcuffed, thrown into jail. For days, they are humiliated, beaten, starved, and fined. The white men laugh as they suffer, and messengers are sent to the village demanding a ransom for their release. Word of this humiliation spreads through Umuofia. Shame and anger ripple through the people. For Okonkwo, it is the final insult. He who once prided himself on strength is now chained by men who neither know nor respect his traditions. The man who once led warriors to battle now suffers at the hands of men who carry pens instead of spears. Upon their release, Okonkwo is silent, but burning. He sees clearly now, the white men will not leave. The time for diplomacy is over. He speaks at a gathering of the clan, his voice loud and sharp. He tells them they must fight or be forgotten. Some murmur agreement, others remain still. The unity of old is gone. The fear has become too thick. The next day, as the clan meets again in the village square, the white man's messengers arrive, ordering them to disband the meeting. Without hesitation, Okonkwo steps forward and strikes down one of the messengers with his machete. He waits, tense, expecting the others to rally, to fight, to rise behind him as warriors. But nothing happens. The other messengers escape. The crowd remains frozen, silent. Okonkwo sees in that moment what he had refused to believe. His people are broken. Their courage is buried beneath confusion and fear. The fight is already lost. As the crowd slowly dispersed from the village square, the air felt thicker than before, as though something sacred had cracked. Okonkwo stood at the edge of that silence, watching the backs of his clansmen as they returned to their homes, heads bowed, shoulders low. No one spoke to him. No one applauded his defiance. There was no war cry, no uprising, no collective fury. Only the muffled retreat of a people who had been forced to swallow their pride too many times to remember its taste. He returned home alone, walking as if in a dream, his machete still stained from the strike. Inside his compound, the huts stood quietly under the shade of trees, indifferent to the weight of what he carried. familiar sights of home offered no comfort. His family kept their distance, sensing the storm brewing in the silence that wrapped itself around his movements. There was nothing left for him to say. He had struck a blow meant to awaken the clan, to shake them out of their paralysis. But instead, it had revealed the depth of their surrender. Night fell quickly, as it often did in Umuofia. The flicker of cooking fires dotted the darkness, but Okonkwo's compound remained dim. Inside, he sat in silence. The years of exile, the humiliations, the slow erosion of their customs, he had endured them all with the hope that there would be a final reckoning, a moment to stand firm. But that moment had come, and he alone had moved while the others watched. The man who had spent his entire life fearing weakness now stood alone, realizing he had become too strong for a world that no longer had room for his kind. The next morning, the district commissioner arrived in Umuofia. News of the murdered messenger had traveled swiftly, and the white man was determined to make an example of those responsible. He came with his guards, rifles slung across their shoulders, and a cold efficiency in his voice. He demanded to see Okonkwo. The village elders, gathered with wary faces, led him quietly to the compound. They found it still, too still. The trees cast long shadows across the yard, and birds chirped unaware of the tense search underway. One of the younger men pointed toward a grove behind the hut. There, hanging from a tree, they found Okonkwo's body, suspended by a rope he had tied with his own hands. His death was as deliberate as his life, a final act of defiance, and perhaps of despair. The district commissioner looked at the body without emotion. To him, it was not the tragic end of a complex man, nor the fall of a warrior who had once ruled his world. It was an inconvenience, a bureaucratic footnote. He turned to the villagers and ordered them to bring the body down, but the elders shook their heads. It was against their customs to bury a man who had taken his own life. Suicide was a sin against the earth goddess. Okonkwo's body was considered unclean. They could not touch it, could not perform the rites. Outsiders would have to do it. The commissioner, exasperated, signaled to his men. As they moved to cut the body down, one of the elders, Obirika, Okonkwo's lifelong friend, stepped forward. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with grief. "That man was one of the greatest among us," he said. "You drove him to kill himself, and now he will be buried like a dog." The words hung heavy in the air, but the commissioner had already moved on, thinking not of Okonkwo's life or death, but of his own book, the one he was writing on his time in Africa. He thought the incident might make an interesting chapter, perhaps just a paragraph. One could almost write a whole book about him, he mused, as if the sum of a man like Okonkwo could be condensed into a few lines. The commissioner's indifference mirrored the broader truth of what had taken place. The colonial project was not interested in understanding the people it governed. It did not seek to learn, to reconcile, to find balance between worlds. It came with the force of erasure, replacing complexity with order, tradition with law, culture with convenience. In the span of a few years, a society that had governed itself for generations, with all its rituals and flaws, had been upended not through war, but through quiet domination. Okonkwo's death marked more than the end of a single man. It marked the symbolic death of a way of life. The structures that had held the community together, kinship, Religion, honor were unraveling, not all at once, but thread by thread. And the people, faced with the impossible choice between resistance and survival, had begun to bend. Even those who mourned what was lost did so silently, fearing what further defiance might bring. Obirika stood at the edge of the grove long after the others had gone. He stared at the spot where his friend had made his final stand, not in battle, but in resignation. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the war that had raged inside Okonkwo from the very beginning. A war between strength and fear, pride and shame, tradition and change. Okonkwo had fought that war alone, and in the end, it had swallowed him. Back in the village, life resumed, though differently than before. The church continued its services, the court its judgments, the school its lessons. Children who had never known a world without the white man grew up speaking English, memorizing foreign texts, learning to doubt the stories of their ancestors. The missionaries spoke of salvation, of light and darkness, of civilization. And the clan, what remained of it, moved on, not because it wanted to, but because it no longer knew how to fight. The machete that once struck fear now rusted in silence. The drumbeats that had once called the people together fell quiet. And somewhere, beneath the roots of the tree in the sacred grove, the final chapter of a proud man's life lay buried unblessed, unspoken, and unforgiven. The sun hung low in the sky, its fading light casting long shadows across the village paths as the rhythm of life pulsed on in Umuofia. The market still buzzed with the rustle of woven baskets, the clink of cowries exchanged for yams and palm oil. Children still chased one another around compounds, their laughter carrying faintly into the forest beyond. Yet behind every familiar sound and routine, there lingered an uneasy stillness, an invisible wound that had yet to scar over. The elders gathered more often now, but their conversations no longer brimmed with certainty or the strength of communal will. They spoke in hushed tones about converts and court messengers, about land disputes resolved not by clan meetings, but by men who knew nothing of the land they judged. The gods were still honored, sacrifices still made, but many felt their prayers echoed into silence. It was as though the very soul of the clan had been shaken loose from its foundations. Among the people, there were those who had embraced the new way of life, not just out of fear or convenience, but out of conviction. Enwoy was one of them. Now called Isaac by the missionaries, he had found solace in their message, in the promise of a gentler God who offered forgiveness rather than punishment. The questions that had haunted him since childhood about the cries of twins in the evil forest, the death of Ikemefuna, the cold hand of his father's discipline, had found a strange kind of answer in the hymns and sermons he now recited with quiet devotion. To the villagers, Enwoy had become an emblem of change, a reminder that even the son of the clan's fiercest warrior could be claimed by the white man's God. Okonkwo, though no longer present in body, still lingered in the thoughts of many. Some remembered him with admiration, others with fear, and still others with pity. Obirika, his closest friend, carried the burden of memory most heavily. He often found himself staring into the fire at night, wondering what more could have been done, what paths might have been taken to avoid the ending that had come. The church continued to grow, swelling with new converts from nearby villages. The white men had brought more than their religion. They brought tools, books, and a new language. The mission school had begun to fill with children eager to learn how to read and write. Their parents, unsure at first, now saw opportunity in the lessons, a way to understand the new world and perhaps find a place within it. With every child who learned English, a thread tied the village tighter to the colonial center. The district commissioner expanded his influence quietly but efficiently. A new courthouse stood at the edge of the village, foreign in its structure and its proceedings. Disputes once settled under the ancient shade of the Iroko tree were now decided by clerks in uniforms, who spoke in clipped tones and took notes with foreign pens. Punishments were meted out not by the ancestors' will, but by written law. Some villagers resisted, but most complied, confused, wary, or simply too tired to fight. Within this shifting world, the ancestral gods seemed to grow more distant. The shrines stood as they always had, but fewer feet wore paths into the sacred groves. The high priests continued their rites, though even they confessed that the oracles spoke less clearly than before. There were whispers that the gods were angry or worse, that they had been silenced. The old stories still held power, but they now shared space with new ones, stories of Bethlehem, of Peter and Paul, of sin and redemption. The village was learning to live in two worlds, but it was uncertain how long that balance could last. The rift within families deepened as well. Sons defied fathers not out of rebellion, but out of belief. Daughters who once knelt at the feet of the priestess now knelt before crosses, their faces lit with strange fervor. In some households, morning prayers to the ancestors were followed by evening hymns in English. In others, silence reigned where once tradition had filled every corner of life. Mothers tried to hold the seams together with lullabies and shared meals, but even they could sense the unraveling. Obirika, who had always been a voice of reason, now struggled with doubt. He had watched his friend fall, watched the village turn its face away, and now he watched the world reshape itself in unfamiliar hands. He knew that not all change was evil. He had seen the cruelty that sometimes hid behind the mask of tradition. But he also knew that a people without memory, without roots, could be led anywhere. What frightened him most was not the white man's power, but the ease with which so many had accepted it. At night, the moon still glowed over the village. The wind still rustled the leaves of the ogbanj trees. But these things now felt more like echoes than constants, reminders of a world slipping further into the past. The clan had survived famines, wars, and even the wrath of the gods, but it had never before faced the slow erasure of itself. And so, life continued in Umuofia. People laughed, married, gave birth, planted crops. But beneath the soil, the roots had shifted. The gods were still honored, but with uncertainty. The elders still taught proverbs, but their meaning began to fade. And as the younger generation walked forward into a new dawn, few could say for certain what they were leaving behind. The morning air was still, the dew hanging low over the village paths, like the breath of spirits reluctant to leave the earth. Roosters crowed, and fires crackled to life in cooking huts, but something in the rhythm of Umuofia had shifted. It was not a thunderclap of change, but a steady, creeping tide that slowly erased the boundaries the people had always known. The converts had grown in number, but now they had structure, organization that mirrored the authority they had once rejected. The church stood taller, no longer the modest building built of mud and thatch, but one with wooden beams and proper pews. It was not only a place of worship, but of influence, where decisions were made and laws quietly bent toward the missionary way. The priest, Mr. Smith, had replaced the more lenient Mr. Brown. And where Mr. Brown had shown patience, Mr. Smith held only fire and brimstone. He was a man who saw no value in compromise, no use for the customs of the people he came to convert. To him, the ancestral gods were no more than devils, and those who clung to their traditions were not misguided, but damned. He called for discipline, for spiritual warfare against evil, and many of the new converts took his words to heart. The church became bolder under his leadership. Hymns rang louder. Converts preached in the marketplace. The fragile line between tradition and religion snapped a little more with every passing day. In one of the boldest acts yet, a convert desecrated the sacred Egwugwu mask, a gesture not just of disrespect, but of outright defiance. The Egwugwu, ancestral spirits of the clan's forebears, had been the embodiment of justice, wisdom, and mystery. When one of their shrines was destroyed by a convert named Enoch, it was as though a lightning bolt had struck the heart of Umuofia. The village reeled. Silence fell. Rage simmered. The elders gathered. They were not young men with hot tempers, but keepers of tradition. Their faces were heavy with grief as much as fury. This was no longer a private dispute between converts and traditionalists. It was an act of war against the very soul of their people. Enoch was hidden by the church, and Mr. Smith stood by him, refusing to hand him over. Where Mr. Brown had once built bridges, Mr. Smith built walls. The clan acted with restraint, but also with resolve. The Egwugwu came out, not as masked villagers, but as gods walking the earth. They marched with dignity, their footsteps stirring up the dust of countless ancestors. They surrounded the church not with violence, but with silence and presence. They did not strike the converts, but they razed the church to the ground. It was not a massacre, it was a funeral, a farewell to what had been a broken promise. But peace, once broken, rarely settles quickly. The colonial government responded swiftly. The district commissioner, who had long kept quiet observation over the region, now intervened directly. He summoned the leaders of the clan under the pretense of dialogue. Trusting in protocol, the elders went. It was a mistake. They were seized, humiliated, and imprisoned, whipped like criminals, starved, mocked. The clan was told they must pay a fine or their leaders would remain bound. The insult stung worse than the punishment. To have their elders treated like common thieves, to be forced to buy back their freedom, it was a wound to their pride and their dignity. But the people paid. They paid because they remembered the guns. They paid because the white man's word, backed by iron and ink, now carried the weight of gods. When the elders were released, their bodies carried marks of shame, but their eyes were still lit with defiance. Okonkwo, who had remained relatively silent through much of the church's growing influence, felt something awaken in him, a final, smoldering ember of the warrior he had always believed himself to be. He no longer saw compromise as a strategy, but as cowardice. In the old days, a man who allowed his home to be taken was no man at all. A meeting was called in the marketplace. The clan gathered beneath the open sky. Men spoke with fire, recalling past glories, demanding action. Okonkwo sat among them, tense and watchful. His machete rested at his side. The memory of his exile, of his father's weakness, of his son's betrayal, they all crowded around him like invisible judges. As the speeches rose and the crowd found its old voice again, messengers from the district commissioner arrived. They came with words meant to end the meeting, to dissolve the unity forming among the people. But what they met was not fear, it was resistance. And in that moment, something ancient was reborn in Okonkwo. Without pause, without discussion, he raised his machete and struck. The act was swift, brutal, and complete. One of the messengers fell lifeless, his words cut short by steel. The others scattered in fear. The silence that followed was thick and uneasy. Okonkwo turned, expecting to see the village rise behind him. But what he saw was hesitation, fear, confusion. They had not followed. It was a betrayal worse than exile. The warrior who had once stood unshaken against entire villages now stood alone against the changing tide of history. He knew then that his people were no longer the people he had fought for. The Umuofia of his youth, the Umuofia of strength, unity, and tradition was gone. In its place stood something brittle and afraid, caught between worlds it could neither understand nor fully reject. Okonkwo left the gathering without a word, his machete now a symbol not of triumph, but of futility. He walked with the weight of legacy on his shoulders, knowing that the war he had prepared for his whole life had ended without a battle. There would be no song to mark his bravery, no dance to honor his name, only silence. And as the village settled into uneasy quiet once more, the sun began to dip below the horizon. The drums of Umuofia were still, and the air carried no laughter, only the distant echo of something lost. The air in Umuofia grew thick with tension, the weight of its collective fate pressing heavily on the people. It was a time of reckoning, not just for Okonkwo, but for the entire clan. The arrival of the white man, with his strange religion and his foreign ways, had slowly eroded the foundation that the Igbo had built over centuries. It was a slow, insidious process, like a river carving away at a stone, unnoticed until the land had been irrevocably changed. Okonkwo, ever proud, was deeply disillusioned. He had fought all his life to protect the traditions that had shaped him, his courage, his strength, his masculinity. But in the face of overwhelming change, these qualities felt like a mask slipping off, revealing only the raw, vulnerable reality beneath. He no longer had a place in the world he had known. The Umuofia of his youth was gone, replaced by something foreign, something that seemed impossible to fight. He had hoped for unity, for strength, for a decisive blow to strike back at the invaders. But when he had killed the messenger, he had found himself utterly alone. The village no longer had the fire in its belly to rise against the oppressors. It had been worn down by the steady encroachment of the colonizers, dulled by years of peaceful negotiations and quiet submission. The elders, once revered for their wisdom and leadership, now seemed weak, willing to compromise with the colonial government in exchange for some form of peace. They had lost the courage to resist, and Okonkwo's lone act of defiance had only served to isolate him further. For days, he walked in a daze, the pain of his failure gnawing at him. His thoughts were consumed by images of his past, of the battles he had won, of the village celebrations in his honor, of the strength he had once commanded. He could hear the echoes of those times in his mind, but they were becoming faint, drowned out by the loud, unrelenting sounds of change. foreign gods had planted their seeds in the hearts of the young. Even Enwoy, his own son, had been drawn to the Christian faith, much to Okonkwo's horror. In his mind, the boy's betrayal was the deepest wound of all. Okonkwo's house, once filled with life and noise, was eerily quiet. His wives, ever fearful of his temper, stayed at a distance, watching him from the doorways. The children played outside, their laughter a painful reminder of the innocence he had lost. There was a hollow emptiness in Okonkwo's heart, a sense that he was adrift in a world that had abandoned him. He had no place in the new order that was being forged, no space for the warrior he had been. Meanwhile, the church's influence continued to grow. New converts filled the pews, their voices raised in hymns that had become a constant presence in the village. The missionaries' reach was deep, seeping into every crack and crevice of Umuofia society. The younger generation, eager for change and disillusioned by their ancestors' gods, embraced the teachings of the missionaries. They spoke of the new life promised by Christianity, of salvation and hope. But Okonkwo could see only weakness in their faith, a faith that did not recognize the strength of the earth, the power of the ancestors, or the spirit of the land. The missionaries had become more brazen, establishing schools and courts that undermined the traditional ways of the Igbo. They gathered followers not just for spiritual worship, but for political power, creating a web of control that extended beyond the boundaries of the village. It was not enough to convert. The missionaries sought to break the very backbone of the Igbo culture, to turn the people into pawns in a larger colonial game. The tension between the old and new worlds was now at a breaking point. Okonkwo's prideful heart, still beating with the fierce rhythms of his ancestors, refused to bend. But the forces arrayed against him were not just a handful of missionaries or a few government officials. The entire colonial machine was in motion, and Umuofia, like so many other villages, was caught in its gears. The old gods were being displaced by foreign ones, and Okonkwo felt like a warrior whose weapons had rusted beyond use. Despite his turmoil, Okonkwo refused to leave. To him, fleeing would mean defeat. His resolve was unyielding, even in the face of inevitable loss. He had lived by the idea that a man's worth was determined by his actions, by his ability to face the challenges of life head-on. He could not accept that the world was changing, that the Igbo culture was crumbling under the weight of foreign influence. He could not accept that the strength of his people, the strength he had fought for all his life, was slipping away into the past, a relic of a time that was no longer relevant. The village leaders, those few elders who still held influence, convened in secret. They understood that something had to be done, that Okonkwo's actions had sparked something more than a mere skirmish. The missionaries had crossed a line by destroying sacred objects, by undermining the very structure of Igbo society. But the elders also understood that a confrontation with the colonial authorities could bring ruin to all of them. They were caught between the irreconcilable forces of tradition and modernity, the old gods and the new. Okonkwo's isolation became more pronounced. He could not see the way forward. His thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and anger, but the path ahead was clouded by uncertainty. In his mind, there was no future without the strength of his ancestors, no way to rebuild the glory of Umuofia without reclaiming what had been taken. But that was a dream growing fainter by the day, swallowed by the tide of colonial rule. As he walked alone through the empty streets of Umuofia, the weight of history seemed to settle on his shoulders. He could not escape it. He could not outrun the ghosts of his past. But there, in the stillness of the village, he came to a grim realization. The time for battle had passed. There was nothing left to fight for. And as he stood under the shade of a tree, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Okonkwo knew that the time had come for him to make a final choice, a choice that would mark the end of an era and the final act of defiance. Okonkwo's mind swirled with the harsh reality of his situation, a world that seemed to collapse inward on itself with each passing moment. The old ways, those beliefs that had defined every aspect of his life, were no longer enough to preserve the integrity of Umuofia. The Igbo people, once a proud and self-sufficient community, now found themselves caught between two opposing forces: the rising tide of colonization and their own disintegration from within. And at the center of it all stood Okonkwo, once the most feared and respected warrior in the land, now a man adrift in an unfamiliar, rapidly changing world. The Christians had gained a solid foothold in Umuofia. Their converts, now numerous and emboldened, walked through the streets with a new sense of purpose. In a way, they had found a sense of peace, a sense of salvation in the foreign religion that spoke of love and forgiveness. It was a peace that Okonkwo could never understand, a peace that stood in stark contrast to the violent struggles of his life. To him, peace was a hollow word, something that weakened men and robbed them of their strength. His life had been forged in the fires of conflict, where every challenge was met with determination, and where weakness had no place. But now, in his mind, weakness had not just taken root in his people, it had overwhelmed them. He watched as his own son, Enwoy, whom he had tried so hard to shape into a true warrior, embraced the teachings of the missionaries. This, for Okonkwo, was a betrayal so deep that it shook him to his core. Enwoy's conversion symbolized not just a personal rejection of Okonkwo's values, but the larger cultural shift sweeping through the Igbo people. The younger generation was turning its back on the traditions of their ancestors, seeking solace in a faith that Okonkwo saw as an invasion, a religion that undermined everything he had fought for, everything he had taught his son to believe. For Okonkwo, the breaking point came when the church continued to expand its influence, setting up a court system that further eroded the power of the traditional elders. The colonizers had not just disrupted religious practices, they had begun to dismantle the very structures that held the clan together. The judicial system, once based on the wisdom of the elders and the customs of the land, was replaced with a foreign court, one where the Igbo people were powerless, unable to seek justice in a way they had for generations. Okonkwo could see it clearly now. The colonization wasn't just a matter of culture or religion. It was a matter of control, of breaking the spine of the Igbo people's identity. Despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against him, Okonkwo's resolve remained steadfast. He could not reconcile himself to the fact that the world he had known, the world of strength, honor, and respect, was slipping away, piece by piece. And so, he plotted his course with a grim determination, knowing that the moment of final confrontation was drawing near. The white man had taken too much from him. They had taken his land, his culture, his people. They had taken his son. And now, he felt as if there was only one last option left to him, a final act of defiance. one that would affirm his legacy and stand as a symbol of resistance to the very forces that sought to erase everything he held dear. The village elders met secretly, discussing their options in hushed tones, but Okonkwo could feel their reluctance. They were old men, some of them broken by the years of compromising with the colonizers. They could not summon the same fire that had once burned in their hearts. Okonkwo, in his frustration, could not accept their indecision. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. The village no longer had the courage to fight. It was no longer the clan he had grown up in, the clan that had fought for survival and honor with every breath. Even with all his anger, Okonkwo remained a warrior at his core. He had no patience for the slow erosion of the old ways, no stomach for seeing his people bow before their oppressors. But in the face of overwhelming change, he began to understand that his time, and the time of his people, was coming to an end. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and it tasted of defeat. But Okonkwo could no longer ignore the truth. The Igbo were being swallowed whole by the forces of colonization. Yet, even as he reconciled himself to this grim fate, Okonkwo found himself faced with another crushing realization. He had lost his son. Enwoy, whom he had cherished and struggled to shape into the ideal successor, had become a convert to Christianity, severing the last thread of hope that Okonkwo had for the continuation of his legacy. His heart burned with rage and sorrow as he watched his son abandon everything he had been taught. The sense of betrayal was unbearable. Enwoy had chosen the new religion over his father's world, over the proud traditions that had been passed down from generation to generation. It was in this moment of unbearable loss that Okonkwo began to question the meaning of his own existence. What was the point of all his strength, all his victories, if the world he had fought to protect was crumbling beneath his feet? His dreams of glory seemed foolish in the face of the overwhelming power of the colonial government. The men who had once revered him now seemed like shadows of their former selves, powerless and defeated. The old ways were dying, and with them, the life Okonkwo had built. He had invested everything, his soul, his strength, his identity, into a battle that was now lost. As the days stretched into weeks, Okonkwo could feel his anger growing more intense. He could see the faces of his people, their hearts slowly turning toward the foreigners who had promised them salvation. The old gods were no longer enough to hold the fabric of their society together. And yet, Okonkwo could not abandon them. He could not abandon his heritage, his people. He had lived by the old ways, and he would die by them. But in the depths of his mind, he understood that his final battle was not one that could be fought with fists or with words. It was a battle of the soul, a battle he had already lost. The day of reckoning had come, and Okonkwo knew with painful clarity that his world was lost. The weight of everything he had once believed, everything he had fought for, pressed down on him like an unshakable burden. The village of Umuofia, which had once stood as a proud symbol of strength and unity, had been irrevocably changed. The white man's influence had spread too far, and the old ways, those rituals and customs that had once defined the Igbo people, were fading fast. The fire that Okonkwo had once carried within himself, an unyielding fire of pride and defiance, had been extinguished, consumed by the forces of colonialism and the abandonment of his own people. He wandered through the streets of Umuofia, now a shadow of its former self, watching as the people he had once known and respected embraced the foreign religion and the new way of life. He saw Enwoy, his son, walking alongside the missionaries, their faces alight with a kind of serene peace that Okonkwo could never understand. To Okonkwo, this was the ultimate betrayal, a betrayal of not just himself, but of the very soul of their society. Enwoy had been lost to the missionaries, his heart no longer tied to the ancestral gods, no longer connected to the values that Okonkwo had fought so hard to instill in him. The elder generation, once the custodians of tradition, now seemed powerless. They had grown old, their strength gone, their spirit broken by the relentless advance of the colonial forces. Okonkwo could see in their eyes the weight of defeat, the resignation to a future they could no longer control. Even the men he had once revered, his fellow warriors, were mere shells of their former selves, hesitant and fearful in the face of this new world. There was no fire left in them, no will to fight back. Okonkwo's anger flared as he realized that, unlike him, they had already given in to the foreign invaders, quietly submitting to the changes that were stripping them of their heritage. In the depths of his despair, Okonkwo turned to his last, desperate act, resistance. But the choice he made was tragic, and in the end, it was futile. He could not bear the thought of living in a world where his pride, his identity, and his legacy would be forgotten. He had fought so long and so hard to uphold the values of strength, honor, and courage. But now they seemed hollow, swept away by forces far beyond his control. He knew that, in this new world, there was no place for a man like him. And so, Okonkwo did what he believed was the only thing left to do. He took his own life. The act was a final statement, a refusal to surrender to a world that had betrayed him and his people. To Okonkwo, suicide was not a cowardly act. It was a choice that preserved his dignity, a way to die on his own terms, in defiance of a world that had turned against everything he had stood for. It was the ultimate rejection of the forces that had taken everything from him: the land, the culture, the family, and the ultimate assertion of his identity as a warrior who would not go down without a fight. But in his death, Okonkwo's story became a symbol of the tragic clash between tradition and change, a story that spoke to the irreversible forces of colonialism and the ways in which they shaped the lives of individuals caught in their wake. His death marked the end of an era for Umuofia, and for the Igbo people, the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the old ways would never return. The missionaries, the colonial government, and the changes they had brought with them had irrevocably altered the fabric of Igbo society. In the aftermath of Okonkwo's death, the villagers were left to grapple with the painful reality of their situation. Some mourned the loss of a great warrior, while others felt the weight of the change that had swept through their lives. The younger generation, led by those like Enwoy, had already embraced the new ways, leaving behind the traditions that had once defined them. They found solace in Christianity, in the promise of salvation that it offered, even if it meant severing ties with their own past. For those who remained loyal to the old ways, however, there was no easy resolution. The elders, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, could only look on in helplessness as the world they had known crumbled before their eyes. The arrival of the missionaries, the establishment of the colonial government, and the assimilation of the younger generation into the new world were all undeniable forces that could not be undone. The battle was over, and the Igbo had lost. Okonkwo's death was a tragic conclusion to his life, but it was also a reflection of the deep sense of despair and helplessness that many felt in the face of colonization. He had fought valiantly, but in the end, it was a battle that could not be won. The weight of tradition, the need for pride and strength, had collided with a world that was rapidly changing, and Okonkwo's refusal to adapt, his inability to accept the transformation of his world, ultimately led him to take his own life. In the end, Things Fall Apart is not just the story of a man's downfall. It is a profound meditation on the cost of colonization, the loss of cultural identity, and the devastating consequences of clinging to the past in the face of an evolving world. Okonkwo's tragedy is the tragedy of an entire people caught between two worlds, unable to reconcile their past with the demands of the present, and ultimately consumed by the forces that shaped their destiny. The novel serves as a timeless reminder of the complexities of cultural conflict and the human cost of historical change. Okonkwo's life, his struggles, and his death remain etched in the memory of those who lived through this pivotal moment in history. His story is a part of the greater narrative of resistance, survival, and adaptation that continues to echo through generations, reminding us of the fragile nature of identity and the price of cultural survival in the face of overwhelming external forces. Things Fall Apart is not just a story of one man's life and death. It is a profound exploration of the forces that shape individual and collective identities. Chinua Achebe's novel weaves a rich tapestry of themes, examining the impact of colonialism, the tension between tradition and change, and the inevitable clash between cultures. At its core, the story of Okonkwo is a tragedy, not simply because of his downfall, but because it reflects the broader tragedy of a society in transition. The Igbo people, who once thrived under a complex system of beliefs, customs, and social structures, found themselves powerless in the face of an overwhelming tide of change. Okonkwo, a man defined by strength, pride, and an unyielding commitment to tradition, is unable to adapt to the new world brought about by the arrival of the British. His tragic death, while a personal loss, symbolizes the collapse of a culture that valued honor, masculinity, and communal responsibility. In his refusal to accept the changing times, he becomes a representation of the clash between two conflicting ways of life, one rooted in centuries of tradition, and the other, an imposed colonial order that erases those very traditions. Achebe's narrative is a powerful reminder that the forces of colonization did not simply bring material change, but also profound psychological and cultural upheaval. Okonkwo's struggle against the missionaries and the colonial government is a symbolic fight against the erosion of identity. His downfall is not just the result of his personal flaws, but a consequence of a much larger, more destructive force, the loss of autonomy and self-determination. Yet, Things Fall Apart is not a tale of complete despair. Despite Okonkwo's tragic end, the novel leaves us with a critical understanding of the resilience of human societies. The younger generation, represented by characters like Enwoy, may embrace Christianity, but they do so in a way that suggests adaptation rather than complete assimilation. Achebe subtly points to the ongoing struggle between retaining cultural identity and evolving in response to external pressures. Though the old ways may fade, they are never fully eradicated. The Igbo people's stories, values, and traditions live on in the hearts and minds of those who remember. The impact of Things Fall Apart extends far beyond the pages of the novel. It has become a seminal work in post-colonial literature, offering a critique of colonialism and a voice to those whose stories have often been overlooked or misrepresented. Achebe's work gives us a lens through which we can understand the complexities of cultural change, the trauma of colonization, and the enduring quest for identity in a world that is constantly shifting. In the end, Things Fall Apart serves as a testament to the power of storytelling itself. Through Okonkwo's life and death, Achebe presents a world that is both familiar and foreign, one in which personal choices are shaped by history, and where the clash between the old and the new often leads to painful, irreversible consequences. It challenges readers to reflect on their own identities, to consider the forces that shape them, and to think critically about the impact of history on our present and future. Okonkwo's story may be one of loss, but it is also one of reflection, reminding us that cultural survival is not simply about resisting change. It is about finding ways to adapt, to preserve what is meaningful, and to honor the past while embracing the future. In this way, Achebe offers both a mourning for what has been lost and a hope for what can still endure. Things Fall Apart remains an essential work that continues to resonate with readers, urging us to question the forces that shape our world and to examine the deep connections between personal identity, culture, and history.